Okay, so this is week 8 of our course, and we are looking at evidence-based practice with math. So you will go through your introduction, learning outcomes and readings, again from the IRIS Center. And then we have some Ohio Learning Standards for you, the What Works Clearinghouse again, and you'll note that there are a couple of lesson plan templates that I'm going to go over in a little more detail in just a moment. For your tutoring check-in, you're going to go through, use the prompt, be sure to check the responses to and from your peers. You are also looking at identifying and addressing student errors, which is one of the best ways to figure out how to proceed with math. So sometimes you can just look at work samples or worksheets that kids have done or watch them as they work and note how they're processing it. If you're making the same sort of error repeatedly, that tells you which portion you might need to go back and reteach and focus on. Sometimes you will need to sit with your student and say, okay, show me how you're doing this and explain what you did as you do it. So for some students, if you can't quite figure out what the pattern of their error is, sometimes it's something that you can't see on paper, but if they talk it out, you can see, maybe we're doing steps backwards or in a different order or skipping a step. And then we can really target our interventions for that. For your unit plan for check 4, you are doing one of your lesson plans for your final unit plan. So that final unit plan needs to have a minimum of 3 lesson plans, can be as long as you want. But make sure that you are checking the rubric for grading because there are several very specific things that we're looking for from the lesson plan with regard to what you're doing, types of activities and CRA strategies. So make sure you're using the rubric as well for the types of activities to make sure you've gotten everything in there. And what we've provided to you here are 2 different lesson plan options. So this is our new intervention specialist based lesson plan template. Our general template is for a general education class and setting. And for IS candidates, we have some more specific things to make sure that we have in there. So the inclusive setting one would be what you are going to use if you are working with students in a general education setting. So an inclusive or co-taught situation typically. Many things are similar to the typical lesson plan. So you're going to have your essential learning, your measurable learning outcomes. In this section here, you are going to have a section where you're going to talk about each student's IEP goals specifically. So what would we need to have for each student related to this lesson plan? So if you are doing a lesson plan for math, we don't really need to worry about the reading and writing goals. If there's an academic vocabulary goal, that would be something that would apply here. So if you don't know, if you are working on, like this is a hypothetical plan, you are coming up with at least 2 or 3 students on IEPs who have individual goals. What are those goals? And remember, we cannot have the same goal for each student. Individualized education plans mean exactly that. They have to be individualized completely to the student's strengths and needs. So it is not okay, it is not appropriate, and it is not legal to have identical IEP goals for multiple students. So each one needs to be separate based on student needs. We still have our content standards and some thinking about academic language. This is another section that's new here is the language demand for students with IEPs. So that receptive language is taking in, reading, hearing, what can I do to help them understand those things? And then productive language is use of the language, writing, speaking, carrying out activities. So think about some accommodations that might help. And with math, I'll give you a hint. Visuals are a big key. So if we're working on addition, maybe a chart with all of the different terms that mean addition. Word problems, if your unit has some word problems in it, maybe different posters for each different operation and all of the synonyms that are used for meaning division or multiplication. And then your productive language accommodation, how do you want them to express it? So as a high school IS, it used to drive me insane when I would get sophomores and juniors come in and they would say, oh, do I plus this or minus it? When you're 16 or 17, we really need to be using the terms addition and subtraction. Do I add it? Do I subtract it? So some of those types of things. What do we really want to focus on? Getting that language in and that vocabulary at a young age is really important. So focusing on making sure students are telling me what they're doing using appropriate language from the lesson. This is your technology. So is there any technology that you're going to be using for your students? And again, you're probably going to use hypothetical students. You could base it on real world situations. So what are some things students might need if they have some fine motor issues maybe, or some low vision or hearing things? In your assessment, your progress monitoring, we are looking at what types of things are we keeping track of. So for each student, the method of progress monitoring is on the IEP goal page. For the purposes of this unit plan, it is safe to put classroom-based assessment for all students under method of progress monitoring, since we don't have actual students. On the IEP document, there are only, I think, 7 or 8 different choices for the boxes. So it would be realistic that students would have the same or very similar methods in these. Really look at that reteaching strategy by student, though. So one of the things we're looking at is that error analysis. So think about that. If one student is making an error in procedure and another is making an error in calculation, and you reteach using the same method for all of them, you're still missing students. You might be helping 1 or 2 students, but you are still missing students because our reteaching really needs to be individualized based on what they are struggling with. So we could have 2 or 3 students who are having procedural inaccuracies, and maybe they're doing it the same incorrect way. Maybe they're not. Maybe we need to break that down a little bit. So these reteach strategies can be similar, but should not be identical because your students' needs will not be identical. Sharing outcomes with the general education teacher. How are we giving our progress monitoring to them? How are we letting them know what our students did? In this section, the big thing here is looking over to the right. This is the part that's different from a typical lesson plan. What are those scaffolds and accommodations, modifications, visuals? What are you doing additionally for students who need extra support in that general education session as the lesson is being taught to all students? And then here, the only thing that's different is we are looking at transition planning. So how do these skills relate to what's happening in the next grade band at the next level? And how can we help support our students in their future learning? And then the other one we have is the small group template. So this is what you would use if you have students who are in a resource room, or students maybe from a whole group setting that you are pulling to a small group for additional support. So again, much of this is very, very similar to what we're looking at with the whole group plan and with the inclusion plan. These first parts are going to be the same here. The one thing I do want to point out is that with your accommodations, whether they are the language, they are interventions, your technology rationale, and some of your assessment things here are a little bit different, your progress monitoring and your feedback, in a small group, you are going to need more intensive accommodations and supports than you would typically need in an inclusion setting. So looking at that small group plan, making sure that you are really focusing in on super individualized reteach strategies. The reason you're bringing them to a small group is because they need additional support and services outside of what they're getting in that inclusion setting. So what are those things that you would do differently? Okay, so again, lesson preparation here. This one has an additional section. So again, talking about those more intensive needs and supports, what would you do for all students? So what anchor charts might you put up that might not be in the general education setting, but that you could have in your small group room to benefit all of your students? And then what are those accommodations and modifications if you are the one presenting the primary lesson? What will you be doing specifically for each student? And then transition planning. So especially with the small group one here, when you are the one presenting the entire lesson, you still need to think about, what do I need to do for individualized students? What am I going to present? How am I going to rephrase things for certain students? What might I need to do? Provide visuals at their seat. Some students just really struggle with tracking from the board to their desk, so I may need to provide notes for this student. So base it on your students that you're coming up with based off of either real students or your hypothetical students at the beginning. Choose 2 or 3 students that have IEPs and what might those students need. I do want to go back to the assessment portion of this one. Because this was not included on the the inclusive setting one, because typically in that setting, the general education teacher is coming up with the assessment, or the assessment is done for everyone, and then you are coming to the small group to take it. Most students with IEPs will have small group testing, tests, quizzes, long writing assignments, projects. So that's why the assessment piece is only in the small group plan, because that is something that you would typically do in a small group. Okay, email me if you have questions. For the purpose of this unit plan, I am not looking at specifically how did you create this lesson plan and expecting absolute perfection. So this is a new plan and a new IS template here. So we are looking at just giving you lots of feedback and what else you could do with that plan. So give it your best shot and email me if you have questions.